William Clark lived a very quiet life, because loud noises made his hands shake. He was a tall man, but he walked with his shoulders rolled forward as if he was trying to make himself small. It was the year 1921. 3 years had passed since the Great War ended, but the war had never really ended for William. He had fought in the deep trenches in France. He had lived in the mud, the cold rain, and the constant fear. He had seen things that broke his mind into small, sharp pieces. The army doctors gave it a simple name. They called it shell shock. They said his nerves were frayed like the ends of an old rope. They told him to go home, rest in a quiet place, and try to forget. But William knew you could not forget the smell of wet earth mixed with blood. You could not forget the heavy, crushing sound of the big guns falling from the dark sky. When William came back to the big city, he found that the normal world was too fast and too loud. The sounds of cars backfiring made him dive to the ground. The sudden shout of a newspaper boy made his heart beat so fast he felt dizzy. He needed to find a place where nothing moved and nothing made a sound. That was why he took the job as a night watchman at the Natural History Museum. The museum was a massive stone building in the centre of the city. It was filled with dead things. There were bones of giant animals that lived millions of years ago. There were stuffed bears and lions with glass eyes that stared straight ahead and never blinked. There were rows of rocks and gems resting on soft velvet pads inside thick glass cases. During the day, the museum was full of noisy children and talking adults. But at night, when the heavy wooden doors were locked, it was the quietest place in the world. William loved the graveyard shift. He arrived at work just as the sun was going down, and the sky was turning a dark, bruised purple. He put on his grey wool uniform. He picked up his heavy metal flashlight and a large ring of brass keys. The head of the day guards would nod at him, say good night, and walk out the door. Then the heavy lock would click, and William would be completely alone. For a long time, the routine brought him peace. He would walk the long, dark halls slowly. He liked to shine his flashlight on the white bones of the dinosaurs. He liked the stillness. The dead things could not hurt him. The quiet air felt like a thick blanket wrapping him in safety. But a broken mind is a dangerous thing. When a place is too quiet, a broken mind will start to fill the empty space with its own noise. The doctors had warned him about this. They said he might experience memories that felt very real. They called them flashbacks. For William, it started slowly in the late autumn. The weather turned cold, and the big building became drafty. The wind would whistle through the cracks in the old window frames. One night in November, William was walking through the room that held the displays of ancient human tools. The marble floor was hard and smooth under his black leather boots. His footsteps made a steady clicking sound. Then he stopped. He sniffed the cold air. A strange scent was drifting through the room. It did not smell like dust, floor wax, or old paper. It smelled like rotten eggs mixed with wild garlic. It was a sharp, bitter smell that burned the inside of his nose. William dropped his flashlight. It rolled away, sending a beam of yellow light spinning across the floor. William brought his hands up to his face. He began to rub his eyes frantically. Every soldier who had been in the trenches knew that smell. It was mustard gas, the silent yellow killer that crept across the mud and melted the lungs of anyone who breathed it in. William fell to his knees. He waited for his throat to close up. He waited for the terrible burning pain. He curled into a tight ball on the hard marble floor, gasping for clean air. He stayed there for a long time, trembling like a frightened dog. But the burning never came. Slowly, William opened his eyes. He lowered his hands. The smell was gone. The air was just cold and dusty again. He found his flashlight and stood up. His legs felt weak and heavy. He told himself it was just a trick of his sick mind. The doctors had said this would happen. His brain was just playing a cruel joke on him, bringing a bad memory back to life. He drank a cup of hot black coffee in the small guardroom and tried to calm down. He finished his patrol, but he kept checking the dark corners of the rooms. He kept smelling his own clothes to see if the gas was hiding in the wool. The next night, the smell did not return, and William felt a little better. He convinced himself that it was a one-time event, just a bad nightmare while he was wide awake. But then, a few nights later, the sounds started. William was walking through the hall of stuffed birds. The birds were posed on fake branches, looking as if they were frozen in the middle of a song. The city outside was completely silent. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. Then William heard a noise. It was a very deep, heavy thump. The sound vibrated in his chest and rattled his teeth. He stopped walking and held his breath. He waited. A few seconds later, it came again. Thump. Then another one. Thump. It was not a sharp, cracking sound like thunder. It was a dull, heavy crash that seemed to come from very far away, yet it was powerful enough to shake the dust from the ceiling. William knew that sound just as well as he knew the smell of the gas. It was the sound of heavy artillery. It was the sound of the giant cannons firing massive shells high into the air. In France, the ground would shake just like this before a big attack began. The thumping sound continued. Sometimes there were 3 thumps in a row very fast. Sometimes there was a long minute of silence before the next crash. William walked quickly to the nearest window. He pressed his face against the cold glass and looked out into the city street. He expected to see flashes of fire in the night sky. He expected to see smoke. But the street was empty. The street lamps glowed with a soft, steady light. There were no cars. There was no construction work going on in the middle of the night. The city was asleep, yet the thumping sound kept going. It seemed to be coming from the ground, or maybe from the sky right above the museum roof. It was impossible to tell. William stepped back from the window. He put his hands tightly over his ears. He tried to hum a song to block out the noise. He told himself it was just a subway train running under the street. He told himself it was just the big iron pipes in the basement of the museum shifting as they got cold. But he knew he was lying to himself. A train made a long, steady rumble. Pipes made high, clanking noises. This sound was the exact heavy beating of war. William ran back to the small guardroom. He locked the wooden door. He sat in his chair and wrapped his arms around his chest. He stayed there until the morning light started to shine through the window. The thumping sound slowly faded away as the sun came up, leaving William exhausted and covered in cold sweat. He did not tell the day staff about what happened. He was afraid they would think he was crazy. He was afraid they would take away his job. He needed this quiet place, even if it was not so quiet anymore. He decided he would just have to fight his own mind. He would have to be brave and ignore the fake smells and the fake sounds. But his mind was not faking anything. William was about to learn a terrible truth. The things he was experiencing were not just memories bleeding into the present. The trauma he suffered in the war had changed him. It had cracked open a door in his brain. The terrible things he had seen and felt in the trenches had broken his natural human limits. The doctors thought his brain was broken, but it was actually working too well. It was letting him sense things that normal people could not feel. He was becoming aware of a reality that existed right on top of the normal world. But William did not know this yet. He just thought he was losing his mind. He spent the next week living in a state of constant fear. The smell of garlic and rotten eggs would come and go. The deep, heavy thumps of the phantom artillery would shake the walls for a few minutes and then stop. William grew very pale. He lost weight because he was too nervous to eat. He jumped at every small shadow. Then came the night of the massive thunderstorm. It was a Tuesday in the middle of December. The weather report in the evening newspaper had warned that a very bad storm was blowing in from the ocean. When William arrived for his shift, the sky was completely black. The wind was howling down the street, tearing dead leaves from the trees and throwing trash against the side of the stone building. The head day guard handed William the brass keys with a serious look on his face. He told William to make sure all the top-floor windows were locked tight because the wind was going to be fierce. William nodded, took the keys and locked the main doors as the other man rushed out into the cold wind. William was alone again. He walked into the guardroom and put down his metal lunchbox. He could hear the wind screaming around the corners of the big building. It sounded like a train rushing past. Soon the rain started. It did not fall gently. It hit the large glass windows of the museum like handfuls of small stones. The noise of the rain was very loud, but William actually felt a little relieved. He thought that the loud sounds of the storm would cover up the fake sounds of the artillery in his head. If there was thunder, he could just tell himself it was only the weather. Around midnight, William began his main patrol route. He walked up the wide marble stairs to the second floor. He carried his heavy flashlight in his right hand. The battery was fully charged, and it cast a bright white circle of light in front of him. He walked through the hall of ancient fish. The fossils were pressed into flat slabs of grey stone, trapped there forever. The storm outside was getting worse. The rain was pounding on the glass skylights overhead. Then the first flash of lightning tore through the sky. It was a brilliant, blinding blue light that lit up the entire room for a single second. It cast long dancing shadows behind the fossil displays. A second later, the thunder crashed. It was a violent, splitting boom that shook the floorboards under William's boots. He stopped walking. His heart hammered in his chest. The thunder was so loud it hurt his ears. He took a deep breath and told himself it was just a storm. It was just nature. It was not the big guns. It was not the war. He kept walking, moving toward the center of the building. He entered the grand dinosaur hall. This was the largest room in the museum. The ceiling was very high, made of iron frames and thick glass panels. In the center of the vast room stood the massive skeletons of the dinosaurs. There was a giant meat-eater with a huge skull and teeth the size of knives. Next to it was a plant-eater with a neck so long it almost reached the glass roof. The floor of this room was made of large, square tiles of polished white marble. It was a beautiful, clean space. But as William walked into the room, the air changed. The temperature dropped very fast. William could see his own breath forming white clouds in the air. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The smell returned. It was stronger than it had ever been. The sharp, bitter scent of rotten eggs, wild garlic, and wet copper filled the large room. It was so thick William felt like he could taste it on his tongue. He started to cough. He put his uniform sleeve over his mouth and nose, but it did not help. Then the heavy thumping began again. It did not sound like it was far away this time. It sounded like it was right outside the walls of the museum. Thump. The white marble floor shook violently. Thump. One of the glass cases holding small dinosaur bones rattled loudly. William dropped his flashlight. He bent down to pick it up, but his hand froze. He was looking at the floor. The bright beam of the flashlight was shining on the polished white marble. But the marble was changing. Right in front of William's eyes, the hard white stone was turning brown. It was losing its smooth shine. It was getting wet. Water seemed to be bubbling up from nowhere, mixing with the brown colour. The lines between the square tiles melted away. William reached his hand out and touched the floor. It was not cold, hard stone anymore. It was soft, wet dirt. It was mud. It was the exact same thick, brown, sticky mud that filled the deep trenches in France. William let out a quiet cry of panic. He scrambled backward, trying to get away from the changing floor. He stood up on his feet, but his boots did not click on the marble. They sank. The mud was deep. It swallowed his black leather boots all the way up to his ankles. He tried to pull his right foot out, but the mud made a loud, wet, sucking sound and held onto his foot tightly. He lost his balance. He waved his arms in the air, trying to stay upright, but the ground was too soft. He fell backward. He hit the ground hard, but it did not hurt like falling on stone. It was a wet, heavy splash. He sank into the thick mud. His uniform was instantly soaked with cold, filthy water. He felt the cold mud seep through his clothes and touch his skin. It smelled of deep earth and old death. He was lying in the middle of a natural history museum in the centre of a modern city, but he was drowning in the mud of a war zone. William panicked completely. His mind snapped back to the worst days of his life. He forgot about the museum. He forgot about his job. He thought he was back in the war. He thought the loud storm outside was a massive enemy attack. He started to crawl. He pulled his body through the thick mud, using his elbows and knees. The mud dragged at his clothes. It splashed into his eyes and his mouth. He spat out the dirty water. He was crying. He was making high, frightened noises in the back of his throat. He just wanted to find a safe hole. He just wanted to find a dugout where the big guns could not reach him. He crawled a few more feet, and then he stopped. Something felt very wrong above him. The rain from the storm was no longer hitting the glass roof. The rain was falling directly on his face. It was cold and heavy. William wiped the wet dirt from his eyes and looked up. The ceiling of the grand dinosaur hall was gone. The thick iron frames and the large glass panels had vanished. But the strange thing was, the walls of the museum were still there, sort of. They looked like ghosts. William could see the tall stone walls and the large wooden doors, but he could also see right through them. They were fading in and out, like a picture drawn with smoke. Beyond the ghostly walls, William could see the city buildings, but they were also fading. The normal world was disappearing, and something else was taking its place. The sky above him was not the black cloudy sky of a city storm. It was a swirling, angry mixture of dark purple, deep red, and sick yellow colours. The clouds were thick and moved very fast, as if they were boiling. Then another flash of lightning tore through the strange sky, and William saw them. He saw the source of the heavy thumps. He saw the truth of the artillery. Standing in the middle of the ruined, muddy landscape, towering over the ghostly walls of the museum, were giant, terrible things. They were figures so massive that their heads scraped against the boiling clouds. They were much taller than the highest skyscrapers in the city. They walked on 2 legs and had 2 arms, like men, but they were not men. They were completely naked, and their bodies were not made of flesh and bone. Their skin looked like it was made of jagged dark rocks, wet roots, and hard-packed earth. They were ancient and awful. As William stared in pure terror, one of the giants turned its massive head. Where a face should have been, there was nothing. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, terrifying blank space of dark stone. There were dozens of these giant, faceless entities walking through the thick mud, and they were fighting. This was not a war of small men with guns. This was a war of titans. This was a war of ancient subterranean gods who had crawled out from the deep, dark places under the earth. William watched as 2 of the massive entities clashed right above the museum. One giant pulled back a fist made of solid rock and swung it forward. The fist crashed into the chest of the other giant. The impact produced a blinding flash of blue light. It was the lightning from the storm. A split second later came the sound. It was the deafening, bone-shaking crash that William had thought was a thunderclap or a heavy artillery shell. It was neither. It was just the sound of these cosmic monsters hitting each other. The giant who was hit stumbled backward. Its huge feet dragged through the mud, carving deep trenches into the earth. Where the giant was injured, it did not bleed red blood. Instead, a thick yellow gas sprayed out from the cracked stone of its chest. The gas drifted slowly down to the ground in heavy clouds. It was the mustard gas. The horrible smell that had been haunting William was just the blood and breath of these fighting gods. Lying in the cold mud, covered in dirt and freezing water, William's mind finally put the pieces together. His fractured brain finally understood the terrifying truth. The doctors were wrong. His mind was not broken and playing tricks on him. His mind was broken, but the break had acted like a window being smashed open. The extreme terror and pain he had suffered in the human war had ripped away the protective blindness that normal people have. Normal people walked through the city, went to work, and lived their lives without ever knowing what was right next to them. Normal people heard a thunderstorm and thought it was just weather. Normal people smelled a bad smell from the sewer and ignored it. But William could see the truth. The world was layered. Right on top of the quiet, normal world of the city was this other world. A world of giant, angry gods fighting an endless, brutal war. William realized that the great war he had fought in France was nothing. It was just a tiny, meaningless echo of this real war. The human war had lasted a few years. This cosmic war between the faceless titans had probably been going on since the earth was formed. They fought under the mountains. They fought in the sky. And they were fighting right here, stepping on the city without even knowing it was there. The normal world and the cosmic world were separated by a very thin wall, and William's trauma had pushed him right through that wall. He was no longer just a night watchman in a museum in 1921. He was a tiny insect trapped on the battlefield of the gods. Above him the battle raged on. The wind howled through the ghostly frame of the museum, carrying the foul smell of the yellow gas. The two giants grabbed each other, their massive hands locked together. The muscles made of rock and earth bulged and strained. They pushed against each other, spinning in a slow, terrible circle. The ground shook continuously now. It was a constant earthquake. The mud under William heaved and rolled like the waves of the ocean. He was tossed around like a small doll. He swallowed more of the bitter, dirty water. He could hear the grinding sound of their stone bodies rubbing against each other. It sounded like whole mountains being crushed into sand. One of the giants suddenly slipped in the deep mud. It lost its balance and fell backward. As it fell, it kicked one of its massive legs out to catch itself. The foot, which was as wide as a city block, came crashing down from the purple sky. It was falling directly toward the museum. William screamed, but the sound of his voice was lost in the roaring wind. He watched the giant foot block out the light. It was falling so fast. He pressed his face into the mud and waited for the end. He waited to be crushed into nothing. The giant foot slammed into the earth just outside the fading walls of the grand dinosaur hall. The impact was louder than the end of the world. The force of the step sent a massive wave of mud, water and broken stone flying through the air. The wave hit William like a solid wall. It lifted him up and threw him violently across the room. He flew through the air and crashed hard into the base of one of the large display cases. The air was knocked completely out of his lungs. He fell back into the mud, gasping for breath, his chest burning with pain. Above him, the shockwave of the giant step shattered the glass windows of the museum that still existed in the normal world. Millions of pieces of broken glass rained down, sparkling like deadly snow in the strange light of the cosmic storm. William rolled onto his stomach. His body ached, but he was alive. The giant foot had missed him by only a few dozen yards, but the battle was not over. The giant that had fallen was getting back up. The other giant was moving forward to strike again. The massive feet were shifting, stomping blindly through the mud. William knew that the giants did not see him. They did not care about him. To them he was smaller than a speck of dust. If they stepped on him, they would not even feel it. If they stepped on the museum, the entire building and everything inside it would be flattened into a thin layer of white powder. He was completely at their mercy, and they had no mercy to give. His old instincts from the trenches took over his body. When the world is exploding above you, you find a hole. You dig deep, you hide, and you wait. You become as small as possible. William looked wildly around the ruined hall. The ghostly walls of the museum were flickering faster now. Sometimes he saw the polished wood of the display doors, and then, a second later, he saw only endless plains of boiling mud. He wiped the dirt from his eyes. Through the heavy rain and the drifting yellow gas, he saw the giant skeleton of the Tyrannosaurus Rex. It was the only thing in the room that seemed solid in both worlds. The huge white bones stood tall and still in the middle of the madness. The skeleton was mounted on a very large, heavy wooden base. The base was lifted off the ground by thick steel legs, leaving a dark, narrow space underneath it. It was the only cover he could see. It was his dugout. William did not try to stand up. The wind was too strong and the mud was too thick. He started to crawl again. He dragged his battered body through the freezing muck. His hands were numb and his knees were scraped and bleeding, but he did not stop. The ground shook violently as the giants clashed again. Another deafening boom of thunder ripped through his ears. A fresh cloud of burning yellow gas drifted down toward the floor. William held his breath and closed his eyes to tight slits. He used his elbows to pull himself forward. Every inch was a struggle against the sticky, sucking mud. The sounds of the titanic battle were overwhelming. It was a constant roar of breaking stone, tearing wind, and heavy, wet impacts. Finally, his hand touched the cold steel leg of the display base. He opened his eyes. The space under the wooden platform was very dark and very small. It was barely high enough for a man to squeeze into. William pushed his head and shoulders under the edge. He grabbed the steel legs and pulled the rest of his body inside. As he slid under the centre of the base, he felt a sudden change. The ground beneath him was no longer soft, wet mud. It was hard, cold, and smooth. It was the white marble floor of the museum. The magic of the cosmic war had not reached under the display case. It was a tiny island of the normal world, hidden in the middle of the nightmare. William pressed his back flat against the cold marble. He pulled his knees up tightly against his chest and wrapped his arms around his legs. He squeezed his eyes shut. He tried to make himself as small as a stone. Above his head was the thick wooden base, and above that were the fossilized bones of a monster that ruled the earth millions of years ago. But outside the case, tearing the sky apart, were monsters that were older than time itself. William was completely isolated. He was cut off from everything he knew. The city, his apartment, the normal people sleeping in their beds, they all felt like a distant dream. This was his reality now. He was a trench survivor who had fallen into a trench that had no end. The ground continued to heave and shake. The massive thumps of the giant's footsteps rattled the steel legs of his hiding place. Every time a foot came crashing down, William's entire body tensed up. He waited for the wood above him to splinter and break. He waited for the crushing weight of a stone foot to wipe him out of existence. He could hear the sharp scraping of the giant's rocky skin. He could smell the sickening mixture of copper and wild garlic drifting under the edge of the base. He realized that this was his life now. He could not fight these entities. He could not talk to them or beg for mercy. He couldn't run away because their war covered the entire world. He was trapped between two layers of reality. His broken mind could not go back to being normal, and his frail human body could not survive in the world of the giants. All he could do was cower in the dark. All he could do was hide under the bones of a dead dinosaur and listen to the terrible sounds of a war that would never end. He thought about his friend Thomas, who had died in the mud of France. He realized that Thomas was the lucky one. Thomas had found peace. William had only found a bigger, more terrifying war. As another massive crash shook the marble floor, William buried his face in his wet, muddy knees. He cried silently into the dark. He knew that if one of the colossal entities took just a single step in the wrong direction, the wooden base, the dinosaur bones, and his own fragile body would be instantly crushed into fine, white dust. He knew he was entirely helpless. He would just have to stay there, tightly curled in his tiny dark dugout, waiting in pure terror for the sun to rise, hoping that the light of the morning might chase the ancient gods back into the shadows of his shattered mind.